A Year with God, Day 97. The reading for today is out of Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. And Moses is addressing the people. It's his last address before he dies, and the children of Israel enter the promised land. And in chapter 12, he's talking about worship. And he says, when you take possession of the land that the Lord your God will give you, when you go in, take down all the idols that are there. Cut down the groves. Chop down the idols. Destroy the altars. Don't worship God the way they worshipped. And this is one of the instances where God actually gives kind of an idea of the methodology of our worship. Although in this first part, it's more of a methodology of how not to worship. Don't worship God the way that the heathens in the land worship their gods. That's not what I'm looking for. He says, but you should seek out the place where the Lord is God, the Lord your God will choose to put his name. It's where the tabernacle is going to dwell in Shiloh for a while, and then later on as the temple gets built in Jerusalem. Look for the place where the Lord your God shall put his name. Go there. Bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your donations, your gifts, your freewill offerings, the firstlings of your flocks and herds. And you shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your households, rejoicing in the undertakings that the Lord your God has blessed you with. So for those of you who like potlucks, I guess you could say that, God here said worship involves food. And this is one of the few places where God does say, this is how I want you to worship me. I don't think the emphasis is so much on the going to a particular place and doing these particular things. Although I think for the Jews it was because it had to do with their national identity. I think. And this is what I think is a big part of it. One of the ideas that I'm kind of groping my way towards is that the worship of the Jewish people, centered in Jerusalem and the temple, and before that centered in Shiloh and at the tabernacle, with their sacrifices, with their festivals, I think one of the things it did is it helped tie them into the story of God. And it took a long time for that to happen. And there were times when they walked away from worshiping God and they forgot their identity. And then there were times when they would come back to remember their identity and pick up the forms of worship and the emphasis on the story of God in their lives. But the focus seems to be very, very much on reliving the story of God in our lives, remembering our identity as people of God, remembering our focus as people of God, remembering our mission as people of God, remembering that which God redeemed us from and that which God redeemed us to, seems to be very, very much the emphasis, as I read this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 12, of what God is looking for in this worship. And I think that kind of ties back a little bit to yesterday in Isaiah chapter 29, where God says, the problem here is that you're worshiping me, you're going through the motions, your heart isn't in it. It's not having the effect it's supposed to have. It's not tying you to the story of God. It's not tying you to a remembrance and a response to what God has done in your hearts and in your lives. So, those are just kind of my thoughts on Deuteronomy chapter 12 and day 97.